A Man Walks into a Bar by David Royce. The funny thing about dying, it makes you want to clear your conscience. I think I've been a good enough person throughout my years. Nice to women, animals, and children and all that. I'm far from perfect and have done things that perhaps you would consider immoral. I cheated on my first wife and stole some candy bars every now and again in my youth, but overall, I have no major regrets for the life I've lived. You won't read about my passing in the news, and except for a handful of friends and even fewer relatives, you won't care to read about my obituary or read about what color suit my body is buried in. At the end of everyone's life, there are going to be things to tell, secrets to reveal, and apologies to make. This is mine. Now, I'm not asking you to believe a word. Hell, even the police covered up the true events because there was no possible reason to tell the truth. Nobody with a lick of common sense would have thought it to be true anyway, so why bother? You just can't change opinions, and sometimes it's better to tell a plausible lie rather than an unbelievable truth. But I have nothing left to lose by pretending these events didn't happen. I'm not a man of means or success, so this will probably be read by a handful of people who will in turn start using words like feeble, declining mental faculties, and wild imagination. That's okay by me, because sometimes it's better to believe a plausible lie than accept an unbelievable truth. Yeah, that street goes both ways. I was sitting, nursing a beer at Gus's bar, as I was inclined to do on occasion. I wasn't what you would call a drinking man, a celebratory shot of whiskey or tequila when the occasion called for it, and maybe another just for good measure if the mood struck me. But overall, I preferred a good old American beer. None of that fancy IPA stuff, mind you. I never saw the need to try and cover up the taste of beer with notes of pineapple, oak, cherry, or really anything else. Wheat, barley, water, hops is enough for me. I always went to Gus's because it was the kind of bar where you could go to be alone with your thoughts. Even the low lighting couldn't hide the tattered and torn bar stool seats or the dusty jukebox that had the same 20 records since they opened. Familiar, but not really friendly, would be the best way to describe it. Not that it was unfriendly, though. There were regulars who would grunt and half-heartedly look up from their drinks when you walked in. A Neanderthal greeting at best, but it was better than some of those new places that were full of pretty young folks who were all teeth-whitening smiles and fancy drinks with 10 ingredients in it. Not that I have anything against that, but for an older guy like myself who had, at the time, about a year to live before the cancer ate away at me like a feral dog slowly tearing the flesh and guts from a wounded deer, I prefer the solitude. I was down to my last swallow or two of my draft beer and contemplating whether to have another when I heard the door to the bar open behind me. A place like this doesn't need a bell or a buzzer to announce somebody's presence. Hell, Gus hadn't oiled that door jamb ever as far as I was aware of. It squeaks and squeals like all those doors do in the horror movies that were all the rage again. Gus's bar was small, with the main long bar directly ahead of the entrance. Patrons who sat there had their backs to the door, and even though there was a mirror behind the bar, it was so dirty and grease-covered you could only make out fuzzy, people-like shapes when someone entered. To the right of the entrance were a couple of round tables with 4 chairs each. The table furthest back was set into a little alcove and was, arguably, the darkest part of the place. The dim light never quite made it back that far, and, if rumors are to be believed, most people chose that table because they were being chased by the police or to have a quick sexual encounter in the heat of the moment. I can't speak for either of those things, but if I were being honest, I'd say both were entirely within the confines of reason. To the left of the entrance was a pool table that was so slanted all the balls always wound up in the pockets on the same side, whether someone actually made their shot or not. The first thing that caught my interest was the lack of light when the door opened just then. Usually, when somebody entered or exited, the open door would fill with light for a minute or so until it slowly screeched closed. If not the sun, then a street light or the moon. It was as if the gloom inside played a bouncer to the light. But when I heard the door grinding open, there was a noticeable lack of any light to go along with it. It wasn't quite 8 o'clock, but the street lights should have let their bug-loving rays filter in just the same. The second thing I noticed was the lack of the usual grunts of welcome. Granted, there were only 4 of us in the place. Myself, seated at the main bar facing the back end. 2 middle-aged guys. Dan and Pete are the names that come to mind, but don't take it as absolute truth. Who were at one of the tables to the right, the one outside of the alcove, and Gus himself, who, per usual, was puttering with busy work while grumbling under his breath about most everything. But the place was dead silent when that door opened. It's a quiet kind of place anyway, but never completely silent. The lack of light and utter silence hit me as odd and got enough of my curiosity to turn my head in order to see behind me a little. Before this night, I would have told you that it wouldn't have mattered if a fully naked Scarlett Johansson walked in that door. All she would get from the people who frequented this place would have been the standard grunt and maybe an extra appreciative glance. Fact is, we were all there trying to be alone together, and the outside world didn't matter much to any of us. I turned my head, hoping to catch a glimpse of the type of person who could cause such a lack of reaction like that. I caught more than a glimpse. He filled my peripheral vision like the moon did the sun during a lunar eclipse. In fact, it was hard to actually see anything else. Now, to be blunt, the man was fat. I don't mean obese or simply overweight either. Now, I've never been one for bullying or poking fun at people with physical issues. Now, I'm no prize to look at, and even when the cancer wasn't chewing me up like a praying mantis does her mate, I would have never won a beauty contest. So when I say this man was fat, it's simply because that's what he was. I don't mean that to ridicule or make fun of. If you were to meet him and then be asked to describe him, the adjective fat would be the first thing you'd think of. He stood at the opening of the doorway, blocking out any light or backdrop from the outside world. He was as tall as he was wide. I put him at over 6 foot, but probably could add a couple inches or so. He was wearing khaki pants and a short-sleeved button-up blue shirt. I'm guessing he had his clothes specifically made because, at least as far as I could recall, those kinds of sizes weren't available at the local Walmart store. I have to admit they were nice duds and fit him really well. His head seemed to be a bit too small for his body, but your head doesn't really take in calories and carbs like your body does, so that makes sense. His hair is short and curly with just a trace of red. A small trace of a smile graced his lips. I don't know why, but it made me shiver. His eyes looked straight ahead, and he let out a breath and started walking to the bar. Well, walking isn't exactly the right word. He shuffled his feet slowly forward, a half step at a time, like baby steps, I guess you could say. You could tell that even this movement was causing him to struggle. Beads of sweat started forming around his temples and front of his neck. The exposed parts of his flesh were nothing but rolls after rolls, all of them looking like they were attempting to swallow themselves into each other like a human nesting doll. As he continued his painfully slow shuffle, a thought came to me out of the blue. How did he get here in the first place? Gus's bar wasn't in the middle of nowhere, but it was far enough away from the main city center. He had to either live around here or come here specifically to get to the place. I'm fairly certain a walk from the city to here would have probably killed this man, and even though I was racking my brain, I couldn't think of a single vehicle that would have been able to fit this large of a man in. I don't know why I had this thought, but once it's there, it's there. The shuffle/walk continued for a couple of minutes, and the fat man, thankfully, made it to the end bar stool with no damage done save for some heavy labored breathing and perspiration. He slowly but steadily planted one massive leg on the stool and proceeded to maneuver his frame for balance. Luckily, the stools here weren't those tall ones they use at those theme bars in town proper. He precariously shifted his weight around until he was sitting, although all we saw was what appeared to be a human body trying to swallow a bar stool from the seat down. I also had to wonder at the strength of the seat. Surprisingly, it held his weight, so no awful embarrassing tumble took place. The men sitting at the tables were whispering to each other in that drunken way that suggested they shared a great secret, but a little bit too loud so that everyone could hear it anyway. Drinking must make people deaf, is what my mother used to always say. In between loudly spoken whispers, the men would laugh and were pointing in the direction of the man. He had to hear, but didn't appear to be bothered or acknowledge the two. Gus came over to the man and scowled at him. Gus's scowl was his resting facial position, and it was hard to tell with him whether he was happy, sad, or angry. Yeah? This was Gus's way of asking what you wanted. He wasn't one for conversation. Whiskey, please. 2 fingers, the fat man said in a pleasant voice. A bit high-pitched, but friendly just the same. Gus just stared at him for a minute, and at first I actually thought he might tell the man to get out or refuse to serve him. His scowl was giving nothing away. But after a pause, Gus grunted and went to turn back to get the order. Before he could, the man grabbed Gus's arm and turned him back around. I held my breath. The 2 guys at the table fell silent and tension hung in the air. Gus did not like to be touched. He barely liked to talk, and everyone knew he could blow his top at the slightest provocation. Gus's eyes got big and his mouth drew back in anger, and though he might not ever admit it, a little bit of fear and disgust. The way his face started contorting, I couldn't tell if he was about to scream or cry. Not just 2 fingers, sir, but these 2 fingers. The fat man then put his other hand up and extended his index and middle fingers together and turned them sideways. 2 fingers of whiskey that size would be a good deal more than normal. But the man smiled, said, "Thank you," and released Gus's arm. Gus was looking a little pale, and this was unusual. Nobody told Gus what to do, especially in his own bar. He'd made that clear at some point to everyone who came to call this place a regular stop. The scowl quickly returned to his face and his eyebrows creased downwards, but you could tell he was shaken for some reason. Gus held his tongue and turned to get the man his drink. He absentmindedly rubbed the spot on his arm where the fat man had held him, as if he had something disgusting on his skin that wouldn't come off. The drunks at the table took this as their cue to resume their laughing and snickering, and I turned my attention back to the last of my beer. Something felt a little off about this whole situation. I mentioned earlier how I was wondering about how the fat man got here, and then it occurred to me that when I first turned around when that door opened, he wasn't even sweating or breathing heavy at all. I mean, if walking a few feet from the door to the bar caused him that much discomfort, surely getting in and wrangling himself through a door that wasn't as wide as he was would have caused some issues. It reminded me of stories I used to read about people coming through time portals or wormholes. They could enter one of those holes and just appear in different locations and times in history. Now, I don't believe that, of course, but that was the only explanation my brain could muster at the moment. But I had heard the door squeak open, hadn't I? I was sure of it at the time, but now I couldn't really remember. I must have been spacing out, as the kids said, and when I looked up, I saw Gus bringing an entire bottle of whiskey from the back of the bar. He set it down along with a couple of glasses in front of the man. "You got money?" He wasn't particularly fond of tabs or, payments over time. The big stranger smiled as he spoke. I will pay you what you are owed, good sir. Seems to me like a simple yes or no would have sufficed, but maybe that's just how people talked where he was from. From a wormhole. Another time and place. Stop it, you old geezer. That's foolish talk, I told myself. Gus grunted and walked towards the small hallway leading back to the restrooms and office. I noticed he was still rubbing his arm from before, and it was getting red from his effort. He didn't seem to pay it no mind, though, so I let it go. Whatever had gotten under Gus's skin wasn't just physical. Gus never let people start a tab. Ever. You order, you pay right then, and if you gave him any shit about it, you'd be bounced out of there so fast it would make your head spin. This ruling from Gus was well established, and he was fond of reminding people of that any chance he got. The fact that he just gave the fat man an entire bottle of whiskey without upfront payment and then just walked away like it was nothing left me more dumbfounded than it would if the fat man actually showed me a wormhole in real life. I reckon, in a way, there was little to no risk for Gus. After all, the man could barely walk, and I couldn't see him drinking that much and then fleeing the scene. It's not like he was going to sprint away from the scene and parkour over cars, walls, or building stairs to escape. Maybe that's why Gus didn't seem concerned. That's what I want to believe, and it makes perfect sense, but that little tickling anxiety about something being off just wouldn't go away. The heavy man picked up the bottle with his beefy fingers, sweat dripping from his brow, and very carefully poured it into the 2 glasses before him. Dainty-like would be how I would describe it. Not wanting to waste a drop and not making a mess. He slowly put the bottle back on the bar and took one of the glasses. With one smooth motion, he bent his elbow, brought the rim of the glass to his lips, tilted his head back, and took his drink. His eyes closed for a few seconds, and I could almost taste it as the liquid made its way past his throat and delivered its burning but pleasurable punch to his stomach. His smile widened as he reached for the second glass. I couldn't help but grin, even if the 2 jackasses at the table were getting louder and more insistent about mocking the fat man. He seemed like a nice enough fella. That nagging feeling, and, if I'm being honest, fear, as if some impending catastrophe was about to happen, wouldn't rest its eyes, but I chalked it up to old age and cancer playing table tennis with my blood cells. This man was just someone from out of town who wandered in is all. He appeared polite, good-spirited, and unintrusive. Hell, I wish more people were like him, in fact. Now, if I would have downed the rest of my beer and left right then, that would have been my take on this beast of a man. But I didn't. And it isn't. And when he picked up a second glass, he turned his head to stare right at me. I really should have left. Everything happened fairly quickly, but I watched it all unfold like it was in slow motion. A movie that someone was playing at a third of the original speed is how to best describe it. The man looked me in the eye and raised his second glass of whiskey. Here's to eating, drinking, and being merry, he said to me. A toast. Now, I was brought up the old-fashioned way and was always taught that if another person showed himself to be friendly, you gave it right back to him. There were already too many untrusting souls in the world, and besides, it was just a drink with a stranger that I would never lay eyes on again. I have to admit, though, that the nagging feeling about something being off-kilter about this man was growing. I couldn't explain it if I tried. But sometimes a man should follow his gut reaction. I didn't, and no amount of wishing could take that back. I didn't want to appear rude, so I lifted my glass and said, to eating and drinking, but my name's not Mary." I thought perhaps a bit of levity was in order. I put on my best fake smile and stared back at him. For a second or two, I thought he might not say or do anything. He was frozen, it seemed, and if it wasn't for his heavy breathing, he might have been mistaken for a giant statue of some sort. But then he reared his head back and he laughed to beat the band. A genuine belly laugh that sounded like the way an old truck might sputter until it finally catches. After his laughing spell, he lowered his head and again met my eyes. "You are a gem amongst men, sir." With that, he lifted the glass to his mouth and swallowed the contents in one smooth gulp. Now, I'd never been called a gem before, but I took it as a good thing and did the same with my beer. My thoughts of ordering another were no match for my desire to just get up and go home. Man, it was time for this old boy to call it a night. But a crash and the sound of breaking glass interrupted my thoughts. I was halfway up the stool and saw Gus standing over the bar with his face about an inch from the fat man's. He wasn't just scowling in his usual expression, but seething, angry in a way I'd never seen Gus before. There was broken glass and whiskey all over the bar, on the floor, and spilled on the man. Gus must have done that, but for what reason, I truly didn't know. It was like he snapped out of whatever state he had been in and was now ready to fight. Gus's eyes were no longer confused or frightened, but red, angry, and insane. You see a man with eyes like that and you give him a wide berth because only violence could come of it. "You owe me $20 and you need to pay up and get the fuck out now." He said that last part, emphasizing each syllable, and spittle flew from his clenched teeth, landing on the fat man's face and neck. I was stunned into inaction. I felt myself lowering back down onto my stool, and I must have looked like a moron with my jaw being halfway to the floor. What was this about? The man hadn't done anything as far as I could tell. He hadn't moved from his stool and didn't even acknowledge the other two guys, even though they were being ass goblins. Gus came around from behind the bar, never taking his rage-filled eyes off of the man. His face was red and a vein about as thick as his finger was pulsating on the side of his right temple. The other two wore similar expressions of confusion. Their alcohol-fueled brains were probably 2 steps behind, and they seemed to be waiting for it to catch them up to date. They slowly made their way over to Gus's side. The fat man didn't make a move. The small, almost imperceptible smile never left his face, and he stared straight ahead for a minute. He didn't appear to be scared, and obviously, he wasn't about to jump up and run away. "Are you deaf as well as a big pile of shit, boy?" Gus's lips were trembling, as if he were trying to hold something in his mouth. $20 and get out of my bar." The two men from the table decided to let their loyalty to Gus be heard finally. Now, I'm sure they were just thinking of a couple of free beers if they could show Gus that they had his back, even if that wasn't necessary. "Yeah," one of them said. "Why don't you waddle off that stool and squish your fat ass out of here?" "Go on now," the other chimed in. "Get the hell out and go have dinner for 5. Alone." Both men chuckled at this attempt at humor, but Gus was oblivious to everything except the fat man, it seemed. Tensions were high, and the whole bar was filled with the kind of static electricity that you would expect right before a lightning storm. I was holding my breath, not sure what to do. If I said something to Gus and the boys, they could turn on me pretty quick. I had no loyalty here, but I've always hated a bully. I decided to try and de-escalate the situation. Surely nobody wanted violence here, right? Maybe I could talk Gus down from whatever wave of anger he was riding and help the fat man to the door with an apology along the way. But before I could say a word, things took a very bad turn. The fat man wobbled a bit, but finally landed a foot on the floor. With a great deal of struggling, he managed to touch down with the other foot and started slowly shuffling backward away from the other three. It almost reminded me of an Old West showdown. The others stood where they were as the man took a few wobbly steps back before stopping. He didn't look nervous or frightened in any way. He stood there for a minute, and then his fingers lifted to the front of his shirt. He wrapped his sausage-like fingers around the bottom button and unfastened it. Then the next one up, then the next, all the way to the top. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was unbuttoning his shirt. Now, I've seen men do all sorts of things when threatened. Some will pull out a weapon like a knife or even a gun. Some will roll up their sleeves getting ready to defend themselves, and some will beg or plead to be let go. This is the first time I've seen someone simply unbutton their shirt at a deliberately slow pace. I wasn't the only one having this reaction. Gus and the other two just stood there staring, their eyes taking it in but not quite registering what it is they were seeing. Gus was the first to say something then. "You motherfuck..." But his words stopped in his throat. The place started to vibrate. Not shake or anything. Just a humming vibration that could be felt on your insides, although it wasn't visibly shaking or moving anything physically. The fat man held his shirt wide open, and little welts started to appear on his skin. Bumps that pulsed out from inside of his skin and then deflated again. More and more appeared, thrumming and beating against his flesh and beat to the vibration, which was quickening in pace and intensity. First hundreds and quickly thousands. It was like tiny sharp fingers poking at the inside of his flesh, waiting to burst out. His flesh started separating, starting at the neck and split open with a high-pitched sound like the screeching of fingernails on a chalkboard. His front seemed to unzip in a single straight line all the way to his belly button, that awful sound ringing high in my ears. It felt like my eardrums would explode in a shower of brain matter. Now, you'd expect to see all the internal organs spilling out from the man at this point, but there weren't any to be seen. Beneath his fleshy exterior was nothing but darkness. The kind of black that was so absolute it actually glowed and sucked the light out of everything it came into contact with. Pitch black and nothingness were all you could see. Looking into it made my head spin and my stomach started doing flip-flops. I reckon if someone had to stare at this kind of darkness too long, they would lose their minds in the inky blackness and never recover. But then, movement. What appeared to be a ball of some kind pushed its way through the dark and started breaking through. As it got closer to the surface, it started taking shape, and when it finally crested, like a baby coming from the womb, the horrifying truth could be seen. It was a head, an actual human head. The head was bald, but you could make out the facial features, sort of. The entire thing was covered in thick layers of a mucus-like substance that dripped onto the floor in the front of the fat man's pants and shoes. The head writhed, twisting and turning as if it were trying to break free. A stench filled the air that could only be described as what you would expect to smell at a newly dug-up mass grave in some tropical location. It smelled like decay, musty rags, rotten meat, and death. There was nowhere for me to run, even if I could have. The fat man was blocking the door, and the three others were blocking the hallway to the back. We were all watching this monstrosity unfold, and there was nothing we could do about it. I wanted to vomit, piss myself, and defecate all at the same time. I'm certain I did at least one of those things, but I didn't vomit or shit my pants, so I'll let you come to the obvious conclusion. The other men stood paralyzed in place. You could see in their eyes, their minds in motion, trying to decide a course of action and escape anything. But they stood three aside like whimpering schoolboys who'd been caught doing something they shouldn't have and now had to pay the price. The head of this thing, for lack of a better word, thrust against the walls of mucus and opened its mouth. A tongue poked out from between its lips and pushed against the slimy membrane until it broke free. creating an opening from inside that world to our world. But it didn't stop there. The tongue started growing both in size and shape. It was a puke green color with slime that stank of the dead dripping from its underside. Covering the entire surface were white little barbs, curled at the tips like a fishing hook. They writhed and twisted on the tongue's surface and made hissing noises as they bobbed and weaved, looking like they were seeking something in the air. The tongue was huge in a matter of seconds and moving towards the three men who looked like they had seen the Grim Reaper up close and knew it was their time to join him in their afterlives. The tongue stopped inches from the men and seemed to sniff at the air around them. The vibration climaxed, and you could feel it all the way through your bones and back again. It thrust forward in a flash and started wrapping itself around all three men at the same time. The men screamed. Shrieking would be more accurate, but too little and far too late. I couldn't cover my eyes no matter how much I wanted to. Their screams were fighting with the vibration to see which would make me lose my mind first. The barbs on the tongue sunk into their clothing, tearing and ripping at the flesh of the men. Millions of tiny hooks wiggled their way deeper as the appendage itself kept snaking itself around the men's feet and up to their heads like a giant anaconda on its human prey, wrapping and squeezing itself tighter and tighter as the barbs dug in, puncturing flesh, organs, tissue, and any penetrable surfaces. Blood was slowly leaking from the men in some sections of their bodies, spraying in giant arcs in others, as their flesh was peeled from bone and organs popped like blood-filled water balloons. Their screaming didn't last long. All of their collective life force covered the walls and floor of the bar. And with a terrifying final effort, the tongue squeezed one last time. I could hear every bone being broken into little pieces. It sounded like boxes of firecrackers all being set off at one time. The men went limp, and the tongue unwound itself from the corpses and made its way back to that horrible gaping mouth attached to a head coming from the inside of a man. The air was filled with odors that I don't think man was ever supposed to smell. Hidden things that should never see the light of day nor encroach itself into the natural world. Wormhole, wormhole, wormhole. The last of the tongue slipped back into the mouth, and the head retreated the way it had come from, back to the darkness and insanity of that blackness. And as neatly as a fat man's skin had appeared to unzip itself down the middle, the two pieces closed against each other and became one again. Except for some stains, the heavy beast of a man wasn't affected by any of this. He laboriously buttoned his shirt back up and stood staring dead ahead, the small smile still on his face. He reached into his pocket as he took 3 shuffling baby steps forward. Out of his pocket came a $20 bill. He dropped it on the bar and turned my way. Darkness came from the edges of my vision, and the room started spinning like a roulette wheel. That's the last thing I remember as I fainted, falling from my stool and letting the black take me. Can't say how long I was out for, but when I came to, I felt a trickle of blood on my forehead from where I'd hit the floor. I staggered to my feet, holding onto the stool for leverage. It was quiet as a church inside, but the scene looked like it came from a slaughterhouse. It's hard to imagine the amount of blood that either lay pooling on the floor or splattered against the walls in streams and sprays. The bodies of the 3 men were lying in a heap, all of them contorted in ways no human body could ever perform on its own. The smell would never go away, no matter how much bleach you used. Well, at least that was my guess. I really only had 2 choices. I could go on home, or I could call the police. But what would I say? That a monster dressed as a fat man with a demon inside from some other dimension that resembled a separate face and tongue did this? That would be a one-way ticket to the loony bin. I wasn't going to live long anyway, but I'd rather not spend my short time left locked away in a room with rubber walls, thank you very much. I decided to hobble my way home instead. Someone would come along and notify the authorities. It'd be their job to take it from there. It's been a year since then. I don't know all of the specifics, but the next day the news made the papers and TV stations alike. The official story was that a man or group of men had murdered 3 people in Gus's bar. The police didn't have a suspect or suspects, and they think it was done by a person or persons just passing through. A random act of violence. They're investigating. It's still an open case, etc., etc. If they had actually done any real investigating, they would have found my DNA and fingerprints from my beer glass. I waited for that inevitable phone call or knock on my door, but it never materialized. I figured the truth was something they wouldn't be able to express or believe, and as I said earlier, rather a believable lie than an unbelievable truth. There are just some things man isn't meant to know or understand. The reason I was spared is a bit more difficult to explain. But maybe the fat man considered my acknowledgement of him as an act of kindness. He did say I was a gem after all, so I figured he had no reason to harm me. I don't know this for sure, but it makes as much sense as any other explanation. I have never been back to the bar. Technically, it's not a bar any longer. A sign's been hanging on the front saying, "Under new management, best books and things coming soon," for almost 6 months. And so far, not a thing has been done to get it ready. I'll probably avoid it anyway, should it ever open, even if I'm not in the grave yet. Yeah, stories are supposed to have a moral or something to them. My mama used to say so. I can't really think of one for this, except maybe to treat everybody with kindness and not be so judgmental. I'm not getting preachy or anything, but I do think the world needs more of that. Plus, you never know. It could just save your life one day. The end.